Heading our next panel. The Honorable Jack Gansler is a professor and Robert C. Lippett's Chair in Public Policy and Private Enterprise in the School of Public Policy and is Director of the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise at the University of Maryland. He is, in addition, a Glenn L. Martin Institute Fellow of Engineering at the A.J. Clark School of Engineering at the University of Maryland, and an affiliate faculty member at the Robert H. Smith School of Business, all at the University of Maryland. He's been interim dean of the School of Public Policy and was vice president of research at University of Maryland. So he's running out of jobs at University of Maryland to do. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And previously, Jack served as Undersecretary of Defense for AT&L, the exact position that our keynote speaker holds today. I could go on at great length about what Jack Gansler has done with his career and for the country. I won't. I think he is known to most of us in this community for a very long time. We started a bit late, so I would like to move the program on. So, Jack, I will leave it to you to introduce your panel.
I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for cutting the bio short. We're already proving this is a defense program. We're way behind schedule. But the point of Frank's talk, which was really excellent, is exactly what we're supposed to be addressing, which is the affordability issue that's facing us today. So let me go through that quickly. I have a bunch of slides which will be available. And consistent with Frank's message, trying to cut back, one of our speakers, actually, which you will see on your program, John Fisher from Northrop Grumman, was supposed to also be on the panel. He had got food poisoning this morning. It was not from eating here at the hotel, though, I should emphasize that. But he couldn't make it, so we are going to try to make up a little bit of the time. And I'm going to go through these slides fast, but as I said, they are available. Okay, I think Frank summarized this quite well in terms of the appropriations. It is, I would say, a fiscal crisis, but the really scary part is the trends that are in the exact opposite direction. Rising costs. I mean, if you remember, I'll pick on Lockheed since they're not on the panel here. The F-35, the reason it's called that is because when it started as a DARPA program, it was supposed to be a $35 million program. Now it's about $130 million each. So clearly the trends are in the wrong direction. The trends on debt, there's some analysis that says by the 2014, the payment on the debt should equal the defense budget. I've seen other analysis, 2017. Demographics are clearly against us. Other than the people in this room, we have an aging workforce. No question about that. In fact, every day in America, 10,000 people age into Social Security. So that's a trend against us. And the research, as Frank pointed out, is the first area cut when the budget starts to decline. So we have serious problems on the trends. And then the world environment is equally unclear. And that's one of the major things that I'll point out is the uncertainty. If I were going to give this talk 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have started off with pirates, for example. And so going through, as Frank mentioned, cybersecurity and a lot of the other proliferation of weapons and so forth. But we don't know what's next. And if it weren't for the first item, we could prepare for each of these. But it's unaffordable to prepare for each of them. So therefore, we need faster capability in response. And as Frank pointed out, it takes a long time to respond rapidly in the DoD. I could be cynical and say the reason that the F-22 is called the F-22 is because it took 22 and a half years to develop it. And that's not a time response to change. Okay, this is the curve that Frank was referring to qualitatively. This is the cyclical nature of defense. And as he pointed out, the force structure, which is the solid line there, has been dramatically reduced, but Congress won't let us cut back on the bases. So BRAC is obviously justified based on that solid curve. On the other hand, if you look at the red lines for the declines after each of the big buildups, there's some lessons learned that we can take out of that. In every one of those cycles, the first three things to go is travel, which Frank talked about right at the very beginning with that question that came in, going to conferences and things like that. And we've had some major conferences actually canceled as a result of cutting back on that, some important ones. But after travel, training and research are the top three that get cut. And that's sort of giving up both the readiness and the future. So lessons learned. The other thing I guess I'd point out is that purple stuff over on the right-hand side there is obviously the optimistic forecast. And as Frank pointed out, we don't know what that will be, but it's more likely that it's going to be going down more steeply even. This is the one that had been presented as the hope for stable budget in the future. It's probably not, as I said, it's probably optimistic. Now, as far as the instability in the world, I'm not going to go through this chart, but this is a forecast of the instabilities, the problems in the world, from cybersecurity all the way through regional instability, religious instability, whatever the causes are. But the world is not very stable today. Okay, so we've had some people summarizing what are the overall environments, and clearly the fiscal problem, the deficit, is a major problem. Mike Mullen mentioned this as our number one problem. That instability and the crisis that I just showed on the last chart, that has been stated as one of our biggest uncertainty periods. And we now have uncertainty in both what we should prepare for and how many dollars we'll have to prepare for it. That's a hell of a way to do planning. You know, if you don't know what your threat is and what your dollars are, that's the problem we have today. And then it's very clear that we have this, because of this uncertainty, constant change. And constant change is what causes our cost growth more than anything else. This is an actual photograph that an admiral sent to me that he took here in the Maryland Marina. You'll notice the label on the dinghy is original contract, and the yacht is changes clause. That's the growth from technological change, from mission change, and whatever. Okay, what do we have to do? It's obvious what we have to do is more with less, and responding faster to the changes. And as Frank emphasized, the importance of maintaining technological leadership. And as the world is changing rapidly, that makes it even harder. And that's the challenge for us, I think. And I will point out that the technology leadership, which used to be funded by the government and particularly DoD leadership, today in many areas, the commercial world is way ahead of the DoD, for example, in some of the IT stuff. And similarly, in many areas, the global world is ahead of the DoD and even ahead of the US. For that reason, every single US weapon system today has foreign parts in it because they're better, not because they're cheaper. This is an actual curve, probably hard to read, and I apologize for that. But on the top line, this is the commercial investments in research, and the lower one, the solid one, is government investment in research. It's clear that the commercial world is spending about twice what the government world is. And then if you look at the lower curve, it's the global investments in R&D versus the combined commercial and government in the US. And it's pretty clear where the investments are coming from, and therefore we should be taking advantage of commercial and we should be taking advantage of foreign, but we have rules and laws against it. That's hurting us in terms of things like commercial, cost accounting standards is a barrier to the commercial. They don't want to pay the extra cost. And in terms of foreign, export controls, ITAR, so forth, we have barriers to taking advantage of each of these. Okay, so what do we have to do? If you say, how do we get more for less? You have to address the 5 acquisition issues. You know, that clearly what we buy and how we specify the requirements is critical. And what we're going to do in this panel, by the way, is I'm trying to set the stage, and then our panelists are going to give examples to address these 5 issues. So what we buy is critical, but as Frank was pointing out, how we buy them are equally critical. And then from whom, that's the industrial base that properly Frank is emphasizing. And then very important is how we support this stuff once it's into the field. That's our logistics process. And I should make a comment about it, and I will about it in a minute, but it's not world class compared to what UPS or FedEx are even doing. And then last one is the workforce, which we have to emphasize. So I got one chart on each of these 5 points. Okay, what we acquire, we have to focus on cost or affordability, as Frank was pointing out. But I would emphasize it's not just for the systems, but it's for the services. I did a Defense Science Board study a couple of years ago, and I was really surprised. Of total acquisition dollars, 55% of them now go for services. So services eating up even a bigger chunk than goods in terms of, yet, by the way, all of our rules are written around buying goods, not buying services. We've got to learn how to do that. We have shifted heavily into net-centric systems of systems, but we're trying to optimize each of the individual items in that system of systems instead of optimizing the overall system of systems. And then the balance of resources is, in many cases, countercultural. I mean, an easy example I can give you of that is when I was undersecretary, 2 years in a row, the Air Force zeroed the Global Hawk, the first unmanned airplane, for reconnaissance purposes. Well, obviously, it was because they didn't have a pilot in it. So I had to direct them to buy, and now we have 4,000 of them, by the way. So balancing the resources to the new world versus the 20th century is a critical one. And then interoperability, we're going to be fighting in jointness, clearly, but I can't imagine any scenario in which we also won't be in a coalition, and therefore we need interoperability. For example, 100 nations have ballistic missiles. Are we going to pick up the phone and say, Hans, you take the first one, Pierre, you take the second one, we'll take the third one? Or are we going to have an interoperable command and control system for missile defense? And so it's pretty obvious what we should be doing. Planning and exercising as we're going to be fighting. I'm sure you're all aware that in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had more contractors than people in uniform. We did not exercise with that assumption. In fact, we didn't have the contractors in the exercises, and yet there were more of them than there were people in uniform. So we should start to do that as well. And then, as Frank emphasized properly, the importance of maintaining our state-of-the-art in this rapid changing world. Okay, the how we buy, well, obviously affordability and design and cost need to be part of the requirements process because cost establishes quantity. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Lancaster's law. The total force effectiveness is proportional to individual weapon effectiveness times numbers squared. Numbers matter more than individual weapons performance. And that's why we should care about costs. And that, therefore, gets us into requirements, and we'll talk about that maybe with some examples. And continuous competition, Frank mentioned that too. The great engine war. You know, the F-15, F-16 engines, we had continuous competition with the two engine suppliers, and as a result, both of them got higher performance, higher reliability, and lower costs. The next program, the F-35, the largest program in history, the Air Force and the Congress said we can't afford the second engine. They don't understand the value of continuous competition. Okay, and I already talked about why we can't buy commercial stuff or foreign stuff, and that just doesn't make sense to me. And then IT systems, it's obvious, the same thing. Buying an IT system is different than buying a tank, but all of our processes put services and IT systems in the same process as buying tanks. Now, say if you're buying an engineer, is that different than buying a tank? Clearly, you don't put the engineer through live fire testing. So, you know, clearly there are different processes, but we don't have processes and procedures and practices for making those differences. And then the changes clause, I pointed out the ship before in the dinghy, but it's clear we need to control the changes, including Congress's screwing around with the budgets. Okay, this is just a continuation of this how we do things. Rapid acquisition we clearly needed to do talked about buying services, and creating incentives means that the people who are doing the buying have to understand how to create incentives for industry. And that's a shortcoming right now in a lot of the acquisition workforce. Conflict of interest is pretty obvious, and spiral development, as Frank said, is one of the things. Continuous development is what we want to be moving to. But I would emphasize that right now, current trends seem to be in the wrong direction. Frank acknowledged the low LPTA as being unacceptable, but that's really, a lot of people are still practicing it, and that just is not going in the right direction. And I could go on with a list of some of the other problems which are not doing what I just said we ought to be doing. And with the industrial base, again, the affordability issue should be driving us, as it should be, but that doesn't mean giving up performance. And that's where we should get into the other requirements of responsiveness. A lot of this is driven by the buyer, not by the supplier. But these are the things we have to get out of our industrial base, including the technological superiority that Frank talked about, and the incentives from competition. But I would argue that we really ought to be focusing also on public-private partnerships. For example, in the depots, where Congress passes a law that 50% of all work must be done sole source, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. That's an area where we have great potential, it seems to me. Okay, and I mentioned logistics. These are some of the shortcomings of our logistics system, that where FedEx, UPS, or Walmart has a direct link in their logistics system between industry and the seller. Our logistics systems don't go back to the industry, and it seems to me that's an obvious thing we should be doing, and providing much more visibility throughout that system. So I won't go into this whole long list because, as I said, we're already well behind. But we have lots of examples of where there's an opportunity for dramatic improvement in our logistics information systems. Just learning from the commercial world with FedEx and UPS, they have total asset visibility. We don't have that in the DoD. And performance-wise, does it make a difference? Performance-based logistics, look at the difference in terms of response time or availability when it's properly applied. And this is actual empirical data comparing the with and without. This is not what I have in mind. This is moving from one village to another. Now, the acquisition workforce is the fifth of these items that I wanted to touch on, and I don't think this is as well understood as it should be. But I guess that's reddish purple, whatever it is, color, shows the budget going up. And what I wanted to point out is, notice the Congress's cut of 25%. When the dollars were going up, they cut the acquisition workforce by 25%. And you may recall that the head of the House Armed Services Committee said, what do we need those shoppers for anyhow? He called them shoppers, this acquisition workforce. And you can see the problem that we have between the size of the acquisition workforce and also the lack of, in a sense, mentors for the senior people. Today, in the DoD, 55% of the acquisition workforce have less than 5 years of experience. And yet, we've taken a lot of the general officers out of those positions. Like the Defense Contract Management Agency used to have 4 general officers. Today it has 0. And they went from 25,000 people to 10,000 people. And those 10,000 people have very little experience, so you'd like to have some mentors for them. My summary, this is a critical period. We really need to accept these needs for change. And as Frank said, he's pushing it hard, and I think that's incredibly accurate and valuable. We really need to do that. But there's enormous resistance to change. I pointed out why we could easily justify BRACs, why the Secretary has asked for BRACs, and Congress has said not in my district. And we haven't found a base that's not in somebody's district yet. We keep looking for that. And the same thing from industry resistance to change from the current systems to the new systems. And as I mentioned, the Global Hawk story for the military's resistance if it's countercultural. And so we have to overcome that, and that's going to take leadership. All the literature is very clear, but more regulations are not the answer, and that's what we've been getting. This is a trend of regulations coming from Congress, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the studies that have been done. When I was at Task, I funded one for Coopers and Lybrand that said 18% was the cost difference between a DoD item and a similar commercial item in those days. Today, Air Force estimates it's like 25% because of this increased number of regulations. Why pay that 25% when we know what's causing it? Okay, the way to make change, the literature is very clear. You need a combination of acceptance of the need for change and leadership with a vision, a strategy, and a set of actions. That's what's required. I think there's general acceptance of the need for change. It's just simply the affordability drive that we've talked about. Okay, my conclusion, I'm an optimist. In the 6th grade, I was voted the biggest optimist in the class when they hold these votes. And I think we can make the change. I really believe it's essential that we make the change. Okay, and with that, let me introduce Carl. We're going to go through a couple of examples now, and I thought that would be appropriate. We're going to, sort of two of the obvious representative industries from Boeing and Raytheon, and Carl Avila is going to cover the Boeing case. Carl?
Thank you, Dr. Gansler. When Dr. Gansler asked me to be on this panel, he told me he wanted to speak to the Boeing JDAM program, which is a program that we're very proud of. This met its affordability goals right out of the box and has for many years. I told him that the last time I briefed him on this subject was in the basement of the Pentagon on a Saturday morning. He assured me this would be a lower key event. Certainly a lot more people in the room than there was for that meeting. But we're going to just to level set everybody, to make sure everybody knows when I talk about JDAM what I'm talking about. JDAM is a family of weapon systems consisting of a low-cost INS GPS guided tail kit that we add to the standard inventory Mark 80 series of bombs. Produce a family of systems in various sizes, as you see there, with options to add things like laser guidance and wing kits and so on. Widely fielded with our DoD customers and our allies, 26 international countries in addition to our Air Force and Navy that use the weapon. Large number of aircraft, I won't go into them, that the weapon is integrated on. We've delivered over 250,000 of these weapons to date. It's been in production for 14 years. And we say as a commercially based model, and I'm going to go through some of that, but this was one of the a pilot acquisition reform program where we get to basically throw out the mold and build some things that we thought made sense on the program, us in partnership with the strong leadership that we had with our Air Force acquisition customer. So very affordable, very accurate, and meeting the warfighter's needs, most importantly. A couple months ago, back in November, I was asked to speak on a similar panel at an NDIA symposium at Eglin Air Force Base. Major General Scott Jansen, who leads the Air Armament Center, spoke to us and showed us how he was going to introduce better buying power into the weapons acquisition enterprise. So he went through the tenets of better buying power 2.0, like we heard from Mr. Kendall a few minutes ago with us. So what I thought I would do to try to answer this question is take the first 5 in that list of tenets. The reason I only took the first 5 is that's where industry has the biggest impact. The remaining tenets are primarily focused on the acquisition workforce in the Air Force. But take those 5 tenets and compare them to what we did on the JDAM program back in the mid-1990s. And a lot of this, I will tell you, is that we're visiting things that were successful in the past, and we maybe have an opportunity to do some of them again. As you heard Mr. Kendall say, achieve affordable programs. We had a hard affordability requirement. We had a key performance parameter called average unit production price required. It wasn't a target, it wasn't a goal. You had to meet that KPP, or quite frankly, you lost. But we viewed that more importantly on the team, both our government and industry team, as That's the number that met the warfighter's need. The warfighter would not be able to procure these systems in the quantities needed if we didn't meet that requirement. So it went from a should cost to a must cost. It was a strategic imperative. And when it came time to determine our price for production, you can bet that we were incentivized that that was our price. It originally started out at $40,000 a unit, but during the competitive EMD program, I'll tell you that that number cut more than in half. And when we bid the actual production program and the final competition, those numbers were down around $18,000 a unit at the time. And so that was our incentive. Even though many of our industry partners and ourselves at Boeing, we didn't know how we were going to exactly get there at the time. We bid those numbers. Many of us worked 2 or 3 years without making a profit as we continued to drive lean and affordable processes into the system. And we've had a great result. Everything's been on time, on schedule, under cost, and industry has made a profit. I think those are some of the incentives you heard Mr. Kendall talk about. We had should cost targets. They were continuously reviewed. Every time you met a goal, a new goal was set. JDAM's a relatively simple system. It's easy to find things that you can remove in a complex system. In a simple system, it's tougher. The joke I used to use with my staff was our job is to figure out how to squeeze a watermelon out of a grape. In other words, we have a very simple system, but there's still improvements, still things that we can do better. We looked at the product life cycle, and we made sure that every decision we made was based on the long term. You had to spend today's dollars to save next year's money. But that was okay because we had, at the time, a plan of 60,000 units out in front of us. So we always took the long-term view. If it made sense as a cost savings, we did it, even if the budget was tight to do that in the current year. We had long-term commitments. I'm going to talk about competition here in just a minute. I believe that this program had the best mix, the most optimum mix of competitive forces, but also long-term incentive for the contractors to perform. Our supply team and Boeing, we knew that we had at least 5 years of production out in front of us when we started the program. That encouraged us to invest in affordability. We built new factories. 4 years into production, when the rates increased beyond a number that we didn't originally anticipated, we built another new factory again and actually moved from the old factory to the new factory over a single weekend and never interrupted our production deliveries. All of this is done at company capitalization, again, because we had a significant business opportunity out in front of us and the market potential, if we met that cost requirement, if we met that affordability requirement, drove us to make those investments. Eliminate bureaucratic processes. This was an acquisition reform pilot program, so it was the first major acquisition program where all of the mil specs were thrown away. Now, there were certainly things associated with those documents that we wanted to keep, but the good thing was the government and industry team was authorized to get together and figure out what process, streamlined as it may be, made sense for the program and then go execute the program that way. And I don't think we have that latitude on many of our programs today. Effective competition. Certainly understand where Dr. Gansler is coming from when he says continuously recompete. I will tell you that recompeting every year does not offer the incentives to invest like we had on this program. When we made our first production commitment, we were told that if you meet your fixed price commitment, we had a price commitment curve, that you would be guaranteed the first 5 lots of production, as long as you met price, quality, and schedule. The program would be recompeted for lots 6 through 11. But the government had the option, if they chose to avoid that competition for lots 6 through 11 if the current contractor was meeting all of his price and schedule commitments. And in our proposal, they actually asked us to give them a planning number for our lot 6 through 11. So we had to project where we would be 6 years into the program. And that was the government's price expectation, what we said in our original proposal. So in other words, referring to the picture that Dr. Gansler just showed you, 6 years into the program, they made sure our proposal still looked like the dinghy rather than the yacht. So I would argue that even though there was no competition for the first 11 years of production, that the pricing for those 11 years of production was all gained in a fiercely competitive environment with those incentives that were put in place. Just my last comment, I'd like to footstop something we heard from Mr. Kendall. Affordability is not cost reduction. Just moving something where it might be cheaper doesn't solve the problem. Affordability is planning, it's investment, it's capitalizing, but more importantly for this audience, it's a system engineering discipline that's just as important as any of the others. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. That's very good. And I think it's important, your point that you made about the competition. It's not just an auction every year. It's got to be based a periodic competition with the option of competition. You may not even want the competition as long as the current supplier is meeting their objectives. But you want the option of being able to bring in an alternative, and it has to be based not just on price, but it has to be based, as you pointed out, on schedule, but particularly on performance and cost. The combination of best value, as Frank referred to it. And I would point out that one of the things about JDAM, I still have in my file, actually, a handwritten copy of the requirements that the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, so it was top down, Chief of Staff of the Air Force hand wrote, there are only 3 requirements for JDAM. 1, it should hit the target. 2, it should work. Neither of those are in 5 decimal place points, but you know, it's pretty obvious what they meant. And the third one was it should cost under $40,000 each. Now, the independent cost analysis at that time that was done on it said it was going to be $68,000 each, based upon history. And as Carl pointed out, they're now about $18,000 each because the cost was one of the requirements. But it also still hits the target and works. It's not just that it now costs $18,000. And that's a success story, and there ought to be some lessons learned that come from that. Okay. Last, John Verno from Raytheon. And I should point out, John, I still have my Raytheon alumni pin from my first job out of college was designing guided missiles, guidance and control systems. You're on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak at this first SciTech event. So, and thank you, Jack. So what I wanted to discuss today, just quickly give you a quick overview of Raytheon. So Raytheon is based out of Waltham, Massachusetts, about 68,000 people. 2012 sales was about $24 billion. The focus areas for the company remain on sensing, or radars, so both the kind that you put in an airplane as well as those that are on the ground. C3I, command, communications, and control for intelligence, effectors or missile systems, as well as mission support. So those are the areas that we specifically target. And in each one of those, as we develop our solutions, continuous improvement is really baked in. So I'm the director of Raytheon Six Sigma. I'm responsible for continuous improvement across the company. And I can tell you that while it was implemented or initiated over 15 years ago, it's still very live and well. Today we have almost 100% qualified practitioners across the company that really bake that continuous improvement process into the solutions that we do. And my biggest sponsor is Bill Swanson, our CEO. The example I wanted to go over today was RAID. It's a program, stands for Rapid Aerostat Initial Deployment. And while this program started as kind of a back-of-the-envelope, how do I get persistent surveillance out into the theater to support our warfighters, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan, the first order was just really for a couple of units. And you can see that the blimp there, right? So you've got the aerostat holding a small payload, which really started off as a EOIR, or electro-optical infrared, so that you could get surveillance in the evenings as well as during the day. Well, I can tell you that this product went through, in a period of about 10 years, went through really 5 product life cycle changes. Dramatic changes in the product, not only from the aerostat to the tower that you see, a mobile tower, which is on the left of the page, through to multiple different levels of payloads. Right, so whether we added radar, we added acoustical, right, so there was a number of different products. Today, there are roughly 20 different configurations of RAID in a period of about 10 years. So I think that, you heard this morning, focus on continuous improvement. Your ability and agility to be able to respond to customer needs was a critical success story for the RAID program. And it didn't stop with just the product. We ended up supplying field service representation out in the field to be able to support these products. And I can tell you that with the initial product, there were significant operational readiness challenges as well as sparing, right? So something breaks in Iraq, something breaks in Afghanistan. Physically, how do I get the parts there? Well, I can tell you that Raytheon took a fresh look at this, and we were able to cut the spares in country by 50%. But raise the operational readiness by 20 points. So think about that. We actually cut the spares, but raised the operational readiness, right? So our customer was ecstatic, because what that meant by not having to have more spares is that they were able to have more operational units deployed supporting our warfighter. So some of the awards and recognitions, I talk about the integrated logistics support that we were able to do for over 9 years. It include total asset visibility, something that we were able to create kind of an a la carte menu for reordering spares. It made it very easy on a web-based tool for people to be able to actually go out and get the sparing that they needed for the units. And also, while this was a moderate technology, right, there was a lot of commercial off-the-shelf, government off-the-shelf, government-supplied equipment. The engineering support for obsolescence and being able to go back and retrofit was second to none. The most recent challenge that we've had was a hybrid version of RAID. This was a President's Award winner just last year. And what the challenge was to be able to reduce generator usage by 50%. And I can tell you that we're pleased to be able to say that we were able to achieve 90% reduction. In the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the graphics for the solar panels that were able to be placed on the unit. Additionally, by reducing the generator cost or the generator usage, you reduced the fuel, which meant that you had less warfighters traveling out to these 500 units and taking them out of harm's way, right? So the ability to not be able to supply fuel was a safety issue and concern for our folks in theater. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see a picture of the unit. We were also, during this redesign, able to take out 20% of the weight of the unit, as well as over 20% of the cost. And over the life cycle of RAID, we've been able to take out, on average, roughly 20% of the cost with each individual iteration. So that's my example. I hope that it hit the mark, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And Jack, now I'd like to turn things back over to you.
Okay, what we want to try to do, even though we are still a little overrun, is to throw it open to questions. If you'll there's a live mic and a couple of stand-up mics. I would want to point out that the message that we wanted to leave you with is from Frank's talk and my introductory comments. These 2 examples that you just heard, not only does it have to be done, but it can be done. That's really an important message, that we have examples of achievement of the objectives that we're trying to do. So if you want to walk up to the mic or take one, raise your hand and someone will come around with a mic. This is not a room that you can shout out questions at.
Jack, this was a question that was initially submitted when the Secretary was here, but I think it's kind of mundane to the conversation.
Sure.
Would you gentlemen be willing to speak to the role that you believe virtual prototyping might have in the future objective of driving down costs and making systems more affordable?
I'd be happy to. One of you want to comment? Are your mics on?
Sure, yeah. I think it's significant. Model-based engineering, the ability to be able to use CAD systems, to be able to actually get in. I think you saw the example of what Lockheed Martin was doing just yesterday. Raytheon has similar endeavors in terms of the CAD systems. We've really tried to implement a tool that's available around the country, or around the company. We've got 80 different facilities, all with that kind of access. So I think it's going to play a significant role.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to that. We're investing heavily in what we call immersive development, MDev, within our company, and we've seen results with initial production prototypes where there's many, much less change initially as we cast things from development into production. So it's a big affordability driver, and it's one we're investing heavily in.
It's a lot easier to do the changes on the computer than it is in real life.
Right.
I guess I shouldn't say this in terms of my own age, but the first intercept of a ballistic missile, I did that on an analog computer to simulate the flight, and then actually shot down a ballistic missile in 1960 at White Sands. But having simulated it, I knew what the changes had to be made in the guidance system to take care of the higher closing velocity and so forth. And it makes all the sense in the world to do it. Other questions?
Yeah. Thank you for the great presentations. It was very interesting. Carl, I had a question for you. Can you make any comment on the role of intellectual property and how that was treated in JDAM and either contributed or didn't to the success of the program?
That's a very pertinent question. Being an acquisition reform program, the Air Force was actually not only didn't, but they weren't allowed to go out and procure the tech data package for JDAM. That was one of the tenets of acquisition reform at the time. Instead, they signed the contractor up to a 20-year warranty where we provided 20 years of support for the system in the field. There's a lot of good discussion going on right now between industry and government with regards to open system architectures and data rights. I believe that the government feels they need to, everybody's pretty adamant about they need to get more data rights and have more control of their programs. I think we in industry just want to have a very meaningful dialogue with them along those ways. I believe there are ways for the government to get more control of the program, but not require the contractors to turn over all of their intellectual property, including things that were developed outside of the IR&D world with private investment. So it's a key part of affordability that we have to have continuing dialogue with our customers on.
Yeah, one of the worst things that is happening sometimes, people will say, give me your drawing so I can give it to Joe's garage to compete with you. That's the wrong way of doing business. Other questions? Any more? Good. Well, then we'll let you try and get back on schedule. I want to thank you all very much. And now your challenge is to implement what we've been talking about. Good luck.